I still remember that night in Chicago when Novus Biotech hosted its glittering winter gala at the Ravenscourt Hotel. Inside, the board was celebrating their record-breaking year, profits up 29%, IPO pre-approval secured, investors smiling like they'd personally cured cancer. The string quartet played something elegant and empty, champagne flowed, and everyone wore smiles that could cut glass. Everyone except me, because I wasn't there. I was 2 states away, in a small lakeside cabin in northern Michigan, a place I'd rented to finally catch my breath after 14 years of uninterrupted work. My phone barely caught a signal, which suited me just fine. I wanted silence, not people. The kind of silence that hums in your bones after you've spent half your life being useful to people who never learned your name without reading it off an email tag. That morning had started perfectly. I brewed a cup of Ethiopian roast, the kind I used to bring into the office before they banned personal coffee makers, to save energy. I sat on the porch, wrapped in my flannel blanket, watching the gray lake ripple beneath the pale sunrise. I'd been gone from the office for 3 days, and for the first time in years, I felt weightless. Then my phone buzzed. No ringtone, just a faint vibration. The subject line flashed across the lock screen in bold black text. Notice of organizational change effective immediately. At first, I almost laughed. Those words were corporate code for someone just got fired. I didn't think it was me until I opened it. Dear Miss Bennett, following our recent strategic realignment, your position has been permanently dissolved. Due to revised cost management guidelines, severance benefits do not apply. We appreciate your contributions. Enjoy your holiday. Bye, Novus HR. It took me a full minute to process it, then another to feel anything. No panic, no outrage, just a strange, hollow sort of amusement, like watching someone rehearse the tragedy in a foreign language. They'd done it. They actually done it. They fired me during my approved medical recovery leave, the one I had taken only because my doctor said another stress cycle might shut my nervous system down. The same leave that had required legal documentation, HR sign-off, and board acknowledgement. I set my coffee down, opened my laptop, and scrolled to a folder labeled Contracts Revised. Buried inside was a file named Clause 9.3C, Retaliation and Medical Protection Addendum. That clause was my insurance policy, quiet, invisible, and deadly accurate. I had drafted it 7 months ago during one of those late nights when everyone else had gone home and I stayed behind to finish projections. No one ever checked my work. Not the CFO, who signed every page without reading, not the HR director, who was too busy approving budget cuts, not even legal, whose intern had uploaded my revisions without a second glance. I reread the line I'd written by hand, the one I had almost deleted out of fear. Termination of an employee during a documented recovery or medical leave period without certified cause or prior board consultation shall constitute an automatic breach of ethical contract and invoke compensation no less than $14,800,000. I stared out over the still water, wind sliding through the trees, and whispered to no one, "Activate." I forwarded the email and my full contract to Leah Crow, my attorney, an ex-federal compliance prosecutor turned corporate litigator. Subject line, 9.3C, breach confirmed. No message, no explanation, just the trigger. Then I put my phone face down, took a slow sip of coffee, and smiled. Because somewhere in Chicago, under chandeliers and fake laughter, they were toasting the new era of efficiency. They didn't know that the woman they'd erased from our payroll was the same one who had written the line that would erase $14.8 million from theirs. I wasn't vengeful. I was precise. And I knew by the time the music stopped at the Ravenscourt Hotel, their celebration would turn into crisis calls they'd pretend were urgent investor follow-ups. I didn't need to be there to see it, because I designed the moment they'd destroy themselves. When I first wrote Clause 9.3C, it felt like scribbling a note in the margins of my life. Small, private, a thing I only half expected to matter. It started as a line on a napkin in the break room, a joke that sounded less like humor the longer I thought about it. The night I stayed late and rewrote the medical protection addendum, the office lights hummed. The vending machine clicked in the dark, and the building smelled faintly of copier toner and stale peppermint. I was tired, raw with the kind of exhaustion that comes after you've carried other people's emergencies like sandbags for years. The Clouds was born out of that tiredness, not fury exactly, but a steady refusal to be erased without consequence. I remember the exact sequence of signatures because I had practiced the moment the way some people practice speeches. The CFO, a man named Richard Hales, signed on a Tuesday just before a flight to San Francisco. He never read contracts unless they had numbers that directly affected his bonus plan. The HR director, Maya Ortiz, clicked approved after a 2-line review and a coffee refill. Legal had an intern, earnest and sleepy, who added my file to the management system and stamped it final because the system requires a stamp to move forward. No one paused. No one asked why the medical addendum had a penalty clause. The whole thing moved through like a rumor that everyone assumed they'd heard wrong. That's the thing about systems. They are built to assume compliance, not curiosity. I used that. Months earlier, when the Argonne line had cratered and leadership needed a cleanup crew, I volunteered to take it on. It was always the projects that no one else wanted that taught me the most. The legacy systems were archaic, the documentation inconsistent, the people burned out. I didn't want glory. I wanted to fix things. But when I asked for protections, not because I planned to be hurt, but because I knew how quickly business decisions can become personal. They laugh with the same gentle cruelty reserved for people who ask too many questions. Insurance clauses are redundant, Richard had said once, hands doubled over his laptop. If you're good at this, you won't need protection. So I made protection look like redundancy. I hid the clause inside a broader addendum that read like standard HR housekeeping, definitions of leave, medical documentation requirements, board notification procedures. Nestled between 2 paragraphs on vacation accrual and bereavement leave, my sentence read clinical and reasonable. I wrote it in the kind of legal voice that sounds almost boring, the voice people skim past because it promises no drama. Then I saved 3 copies. One uploaded to the company's contract management system under Employee Agreements Active. One copy synced to my personal encrypted cloud. Not a braggart's backup, but the habit of someone who'd lost track of trust years ago. The last one, the paper copy, I folded and slid into the top drawer of my desk, beneath a stack of old project timelines. It felt ridiculous then. It felt like a secret talisman. When they told me to take on Argonne, they assumed I'd fail because they'd always assumed I'd leave the mess undone to make room for someone else. What they didn't know was how methodical I'd been. I logged every meeting, every cut they requested, every approval that came through an email with the subject line, urgent, budget adjustment. I archived a dozen memos that, in aggregate, looked like a map of how an organization quietly removes the inconvenient. Writing a clause is one thing. Making it act like a living safeguard, that was the work. I had to ensure it was legally airtight, but not ostentatious. Too much attention and someone might remove it. Too little and it would be buried where even audits wouldn't reach. So I made it matter in the narrowest, most enforceable way. Tie it to documented medical leave, specify the 5-day payment window, attach calculated damages tied to lost vesting and market impact. Legalese, dry on the surface, lethal beneath it. On my 3rd night at the office, the one where the vending machine and copier were the only witnesses, I printed a single copy, signed it, and walked it down to Richard's assistant. He scribbled RECVD on his pad, shoved it into a tray, and that was that. I logged the moment in a file titled SR Clauses Notes. Habit, paranoia, prudence, call it what you will. So when the termination email arrived while I was staring at the hush of the lake, I did what I'd planned for. I forwarded, I activated, and I let the mechanism breathe. But activation didn't mean I would sit idle and watch. It meant setting a sequence into motion precise enough that any scramble on their end would only make the damage more apparent. My job then was to wait with patience, not to gloat. Leah, my attorney, was surgical about timing. She taught me to think like someone who knew corporate panic intimately, not as a moment of chaos to be feared, but as a vector for accountability. When I hit send on the email to Leah, I wrote nothing but the file and the single word, activate. She called within an hour. Her voice is never loud. It's the kind of tone that belongs to people who can fill a courtroom without shouting. We'll give them a short window to respond. 5 days. That's our leverage. Make no statements. Don't answer HR. Let them escalate internally. They'll circle the wagons and then point fingers. That's when the paper trail grows interesting. That was all she needed from me. I handed over the folder I'd kept for years. Emails where approvals were implied, memos where decisions were thinly justified, and one petty internal note from Maya that read in its passive-aggressive way, "We should move the Argonne team during Q4 to align resources." I didn't have to embellish. The paper spoke for itself. The first domino fell that night. A truncated, barely civil email from Maya, "Can we talk tomorrow?" followed by an even stranger one from Richard. "Please confirm you received our termination notice. We'd like to discuss options." Sampled panic. They were trying to negotiate. It's always a curious blend of fear and bargaining when powerful people realize they might have overlooked a line they considered trivial. What I liked most was how predictable they became. I could see their moves as if someone had slid the chess pieces into place and let me watch from afar. Denise from legal would convene a meeting. The CFO would insist they were acting in good faith. HR would attempt to reframe the termination as an administrative error. And beneath it all, a mutual, quiet hope that a problem of this size could be fixed without admitting fault. Leah's plan was patient cruelty. She let them run through those motions while she tightened the legal noose in private. Notices went to insurers, to board counsel, and to the company's corporate secretary with an exacting cover letter that described the breach in unemotional terms. Date, action, clause, demand. No theatrics, no press releases, just the law in a language they could not twist. As they scrambled, I did the one thing I always forgot to do for myself. I breathed. I made a list of mundane things, change the oil in my car, buy a new kettle, call my mother. The absurdity of checklisting felt like an anchor. The legal machinery moved like an old engine, slow in some places, sudden in others. I watched it, noting the moments when their faces must have gone white, imagining Richard flipping through the contract pages and finding his own signature beneath the paragraph he'd never read. That evening, as the sky over the lake turned the color of old pewter, my phone buzzed once. A single, unread message from an unknown sender. "We need to talk. Urgent." No name attached. No institution. Just 3 words that could mean anything. I stared at it for a long time. Then I set the phone down, wrapped my blanket tighter, and walked to the water's edge. The wind smelled like rain. Somewhere in Chicago, a gala that had begun with laughter was morphing into a different noise. Low-voiced meetings, the kind with doors closed and coffee left untouched. The clause had been written months ago in a room that hummed with fluorescent light. Now there would be the quietest of weapons turned loud. I didn't open the message, not yet. Because the point of a trap, the legal kind, the human kind, is not merely to catch, it's to reveal. And they still hadn't noticed they'd been baited.
I didn't need to be in Chicago to know what the office looked like that Monday morning. I'd spent enough years inside Novus Biotech's sterile, glass-walled headquarters to imagine every flicker of fluorescent light and every nervous half-whisper that echoed through its hallways. Someone would have been standing at the espresso machine, stirring sugar into their coffee while pretending not to listen. Someone else, probably Maya, would have already called legal. And in conference room 3B, Richard would be pacing in his expensive suit, tapping his pen against the glass, rehearsing excuses for a disaster he didn't yet understand. At 9:14 a.m., Leah forwarded me an internal email chain she'd been copied on, not because they meant to include her, but because, in their panic, someone at Novus had hit reply all. The subject line, urgent, clause 9.3c, verification needed. The first line was almost poetic in its confusion. Does this clause actually exist? Then a reply from Denise in legal, Kurtz, and clinical. Yes, it exists. Signed by Richard, countersigned by Maya, enforceable, confirmed in digital archives and paper copy. Another line from Richard, time-stamped 3 minutes later. How could this have been approved without oversight? And finally, Maya's reply, the digital equivalent to a nervous whisper. I thought it was standard medical compliance language. It looked routine. Leah added a short note at the bottom of the email when she sent it to me. They're unspooling, let them. I smiled into my coffee. That phrase, let them, had become our mantra. The first time she'd said it, years ago, we were sitting in a courthouse cafeteria after one of her cases. A corporate defendant had accidentally admitted to fraud while trying to prove innocence. I asked her if she ever felt bad for them. She just shrugged. When people build systems designed to crush others, they never imagine the gears can turn both ways. And that's exactly what was happening at Novus. The gears were turning, just not for them anymore. By mid-afternoon, I received another email, this one from a private address I didn't recognize. The subject line, can we resolve this quietly? The body was short. No greeting, no signature, just, we're willing to discuss a settlement to avoid escalation. Please contact HR immediately. Leah read it and then laughed. Not cruelly, just knowingly. She said, they still think this is a negotiation. It's not. She drafted a response that could have been mistaken for an act of mercy. Per clause 9.3c, payment must be rendered within 5 business days. Noncompliance triggers escalation to the Securities Commission due to pre-IPO material breach. Please direct future correspondence through counsel. Her tone was ice in written form. Calm, factual, merciless. We didn't threaten. We didn't warn. We simply reminded them of the clock that had already started ticking. 5 days. That was the window they had left to avoid public disaster. Somewhere between day 2 and 3, the first article appeared. Not about me, not yet, but about them. A small business news site published a piece titled, Novus Biotech's IPO faces last-minute compliance delays. The article mentioned contractual irregularities and executive oversight issues. Someone had leaked the panic, and reporters could smell blood in the water. I didn't have to wonder who had done it. Leaks like that don't happen by accident. They happen when internal loyalty fractures under pressure. Someone had realized they were standing on a sinking ship and wanted the world to know they weren't the one who drilled the hole. By the end of that same day, 3 board members had scheduled emergency meetings. The CEO, who once called me a stabilizer during an earnings review, was now trapped in back-to-back calls with lawyers, investors, and insurance representatives trying to decipher how an invisible clause could cost them $14.8 million and jeopardize their IPO. And the irony? Every one of those people had once ignored my emails when I asked for policy reviews. That evening, Leah and I sat in her office overlooking the Chicago River. The city glowed beneath the frost, each window a flicker of a life we didn't need to understand to know it existed. She poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and slid across one table to me. You understand what happens next, she said. They'll try to buy time. They'll claim administrative error, offer partial payment, or beg for confidentiality. It's textbook damage control. I nodded, and we don't give them any of it. Leah smiled faintly. You learned quickly. I looked out the window.
I learned from the best. She leaned back, studying me with that quiet, sharp gaze she always used when she was 2 steps ahead of everyone else. She said, "You're remarkably calm." I'm not calm. I'm finished being surprised. That night, I checked the time, 10:37 p.m. The company had less than 48 hours before the breach became official. I opened my laptop, not to gloat, but to write. Not an email, a letter. I addressed it to Richard. "Dear Richard, you once told me protection clauses were redundant if I was good at my job. I suppose you were right. They're redundant for the company that keeps its promises. Unfortunately, Novus didn't. Sincerely, the woman who wrote your favorite redundancy." I didn't send it. Not yet. Maybe never. It wasn't about revenge anymore, not in the cinematic sense. It was about equilibrium, about proving that the quiet ones, the ones who stay late, fix what others break, and get erased when convenient, aren't invisible after all. As I saved the letter, another email came in, this one from a familiar name, Maya Ortiz. The subject line made me pause. "Please, can we talk?" Her message was longer than the rest. Emotional, hesitant. She wrote that she hadn't known, that she'd just followed protocol, that she had admired me once back when the company wasn't built on politics and backroom promises. At the end, she wrote, "You didn't deserve this. None of it. They used us all." For the first time since this started, I hesitated. Because she wasn't wrong. But then I remembered the silence in the break room that day they announced the layoffs, the way no one looked at me as I boxed up 14 years of work. Everyone had played their part, willingly or not. So I closed her email, unanswered. Because forgiveness was never part of Clause 9.3c. By sunrise, my phone buzzed again. A message from Leah. Short, calm, final. Funds transferred, 14.8 million, confirmed. We're done. I set my phone down and exhaled, not relief exactly, more like release. Somewhere behind those mirrored glass walls, a handful of people were learning what accountability looked like when written in plain English. And me? I wasn't celebrating. I was already packing my bags for Michigan, heading back to the lake where it all began. Because revenge isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the correction.
For 2 days, the world didn't know, but on the third, the silence cracked. It started with the push notification at 7:42 a.m. from MarketScope, one of those finance apps that loves dramatic language. Novus Biotech rocked by internal payout scandal, $14.8 million clause halts IPO. I sat at the diner off Route 22, a cup of burnt coffee in my hands, the smell of bacon and cold syrup hanging in the air. The waitress was humming something from the radio, completely unaware that the story gluing across my phone screen was mine. I scrolled, scanning words I didn't write but recognized as my own history twisted into headlines. Unnamed former compliance executive invoked hidden contractual clause after wrongful termination. Insiders call it the most expensive oversight in company history. There it was, the sentence that made the world turn its head. Clause 9.3c, Retaliation and Medical Protection Addendum. Someone had leaked the actual wording, not all of it, but enough. Enough for every business reporter in the country to salivate. Leah called 10 minutes later. "You're trending," she said flatly. "That sounds terrible," I replied.
It is, she said, for them. By noon, Novus's stock had dropped 9%. The IPO was on indefinite hold. Executives who once strutted through the office now walked with their heads down, avoiding the cameras stationed outside the building. And in every boardroom, every emergency meeting, one question echoed. Who was she? Because I hadn't spoken publicly. Leah made sure of that. We didn't confirm or deny. We just existed in silence, and that silence was louder than any denial they could offer. The CEO, Thomas K. Donnelly, gave a statement to CNBC that was supposed to calm investors. This was an isolated administrative error. We have reached a private resolution and are moving forward confidently toward restructuring. It was exactly the kind of bland damage control I'd expected, except his face betrayed him. His jaw tightened on the word private, because private had just cost him $14.8 million, his CFO's career, and his company's reputation. Meanwhile, inside the company, the culture began to rot from the inside out. Maya called me again, not from her work number this time, but from a prepaid line. They're eating each other alive, she said, her voice a brittle whisper. Richard's been suspended pending review. Denise resigned yesterday. They're blaming me for not catching your claws. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to feel pity, I really did. But pity requires distance, and I still remember the way she'd avoided my eyes when she handed me that pink envelope on restructuring day. You knew what you were signing, I said quietly. I didn't read it, she confessed. I trusted the system. That's the problem, Maya. You all trusted the system. You just never thought it could trust me back. She didn't reply. The line went silent, then disconnected. 2 days later, Leah sent me a clipping from the Wall Street Journal. Novus compliance failure exposes systemic negligence, board under federal review. Federal. That word carried weight. Apparently, the Securities Commission had taken an interest. A pre-IPO compliance breach wasn't just embarrassing, it was reportable. The payout, the termination during medical leave, the attempt to suppress the clause, it all qualified as ethical misrepresentation. And the best part? Clause 9.3c had been written with board consultation requirements. They had violated their own bylaws when they approved my termination without board notice. Leah called it a self-inflicted wound with paperwork. 3 weeks later, Novus Biotech officially withdrew its public offering filing. The headline hit at 8:03 a.m. Novus abandons public offering amid legal controversy. Their investors pulled out, their valuation collapsed, and for the first time in 15 years, my inbox, the one tied to my old company email that they'd forgotten to deactivate, was full of messages. From interns, from analysts, from people I trained, mentored, fought for. You were right. I'm sorry I stayed quiet. We all knew something was wrong. Thank you for doing what we couldn't. I read every one of them. I didn't respond. Not out of arrogance, but because some moments are better left wordless. By mid-November, the company that once paid me in silence was now paying lawyers in panic. The last I heard, Richard had fled to Florida for health reasons. Maya had taken a consulting role at a startup. Thomas was under investigation for investor misrepresentation, and Clause 9.3c, my little line of survival, was now being studied in business law seminars across the country as the Novus precedent. I didn't buy a new car or a mansion. I didn't go on talk shows or write a tell-all. I just bought the cabin I'd rented and fixed the roof that leaked every time it rained. One night, as snow started to fall over the lake, Leah called again. You did it, she said simply. No, I replied. I just made them read what they'd signed. There was a pause. You know, Leah said, you could do this for a living. Consulting, corporate compliance, protecting people from companies like them. I smiled. Maybe someday. She laughed softly. Someday always starts when you stop being angry. When the call ended,
I stood on the porch, watching flakes drift into the water until the reflection of the cabin lights blurred into silver. I thought about what revenge really was. Not a weapon, not a scream, just a mirror, held steady until the guilty were forced to look at themselves. They had fired me to save money. My claws had cost them their future. And in the quiet of that snowy night, I realized something simple, something I'd known all along but never said out loud. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is put her name on her own protection.
Winter settled deep and quiet, the kind of silence that hums through the air when the world finally stops spinning. It had been 6 months since Novus Biotech fell apart. The stock never recovered, the IPO never resurfaced, the headlines faded, replaced by newer scandals, but my name, though still unspoken, lived in the background of every corporate conversation that began with, "Let's double-check the contract before HR finalizes this." That was enough for me. I'd spent too many years buried in risk assessments, auditing ethics policies that only looked good on PowerPoint slides. But now, for the first time, I was writing something that mattered, not for them, but for people like me. The day my attorney, Leah, drove up to the cabin, snow still clinging to her SUV, I knew she was here to talk business. She stepped out, sunglasses on, holding a leather folder. "You ready to change a few more rules?" I raised an eyebrow. "It depends. I get to write the fine print this time?" She grinned. "That's the idea." The plan was deceptively simple. We'd build a consulting firm, small at first, focused on contract fairness, ethical compliance, and employee protection. No corporate sugarcoating, no buried clauses, just pure transparency and airtight protection for the people who didn't know how to read legalese. We called it Legacy Compliance Group. Leah handled the legal backbone. I managed the strategy. Within 2 months, we had 5 clients, 3 startups, 1 hospital group, and a nonprofit that had just fired its entire HR team for shady practices. Each contract I reviewed felt like peeling back layers of quiet betrayal, hidden non-compete traps, unpayable bonus clauses, termination conditions worded to make quitting sound like a crime. Every time I spotted one, I remembered sitting in that sterile HR office months ago, my hands shaking, my voice steady, my mind screaming, "Read everything." And I smiled, because now I was helping others do the same. Then, one morning in late February, an email arrived from an address that froze me mid-sip of coffee. From m.bennett@novuslegal.com. Subject: Request for confidential consultation. Maya. The same HR director who'd signed my termination papers. For a full minute, I just stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Part of me wanted to delete it, to let it vanish like the silence she'd given me when I needed her most. But curiosity is a strange thing. It never really dies. So I opened it. "Alexis, I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm working with a group of former employees filing a class action for wrongful terminations linked to compliance cover-ups at Novus. We could use your expertise, and maybe your testimony." I set the cup down slowly. Revenge had long since cooled, but justice, real, patient justice, had just knocked again. Leah was cautious. "If you get involved, they'll know it's you. You'll be stepping into the light this time." I knew she was right, but something in me had shifted. The anger that once burned now felt like direction, purpose. "Let them know," I said. "It's time they stop fearing the rumor and start fearing the truth." The case hit national news 3 months later. Whistleblower group, led by former Novus HR director, files federal class action for wrongful terminations linked to compliance cover-ups. And buried deep in the court documents, for the first time, my name appeared publicly. Alexis Ward, Senior Compliance Counsel, 2018-2024. That single line sparked a wildfire.
Emails, messages, interviews. People wanted to hear my side. But I didn't give them drama or revenge. I gave them something else. Clarity. I told one journalist, I didn't destroy a company. They destroyed themselves when they stopped believing rules applied to them. It became the quote that defined me. By autumn, Legacy Compliance Group had tripled its clients. We partnered with 2 universities to develop an ethical termination protocol, a model that required companies to offer independent legal reviews before any firing during medical or maternity leave. They named it informally in academic circles as the Ward Clause. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had once written a clause to protect myself. Now I was writing one to protect everyone. One evening, Leah and I sat on the porch of the cabin, now renovated, with wide glass windows overlooking the lake. The air was crisp, 1,000 fireflies flickered like scattered gold. You know, Leah said, most people chase power or money after something like this. You chose something weirder. Integrity. I smiled softly. That's because integrity pays better than revenge. It just takes longer to cash in. She laughed, clinking a glass against mine. To the legacy clause. To never being blindsided again, I replied. That night, I stood by the window watching the moon ripple across the water. My phone buzzed with another notification. A news article about a Fortune 500 firm quietly revising its termination policies to prevent another Novus incident. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind. The kind that comes when the storm finally accepts it's over. They fired me at a company party. They laughed, toasted, and thought they had erased me. But all they really did was hand me the pen. And I wrote my own ending, because the best revenge isn't destruction, it's reconstruction. And every clause I write now carries a signature they'll never forget.